For as long as she could remember, Sally Brooks had lived with her grandmother in a small town in Maine that had long been famous for its dense forests, rivers, and lakes. As a little girl, she had fallen in love with the nature of her native land and knew practically everything about it. Sally liked to swim in the lake and wander the winding forest paths, dreaming that one day it would lead her to a fairy tale castle where, beyond the walls, a handsome prince would live. The girl had no memory of her mother, and by the time she came of age, she considered her grandmother the closest and dearest person in the world to her. Mrs. Brooks, trying not to break her granddaughter's heart, preferred not to remind Sally that her mother had died during childbirth and that her father had abandoned them long before the girl was born. That's how they lived, always understanding each other and supporting one another in everything. That was, of course, until time, merciless time, came for Mrs. Brooks, as it usually comes for everyone. The old woman was hospitalized with complications after a chronic illness. She never came out, dying just a few days before her birthday. Sally's grief was immeasurable. By will of relentless fate, the unfortunate girl became an orphan at the age of just under 20 years. Alone, she chose not to give up and continued to keep her home in perfect order, trying to keep everything just as it was when her grandmother was still alive. Despite her impressive appearance and slim figure, Sally, at the time, had no boyfriend. This was likely due to her innate modesty, coupled with the good upbringing that her grandmother had provided her. Quite a few young men had tried and failed in their attempts to woo Sally. She simply smiled at each of her suitors' shabby advances, making their hearts beat with renewed vigor. No relationship would come out of this, though. When James Newman appeared in town, Sally's life was flipped on its head. It wasn't that he was a handsome fellow or some seductive womanizer. No, it was the lad's character that drew the lonely orphan in against her will. James turned out to be a good guy and immediately turned his attention to the modest beauty, Sally, setting himself the goal of winning her heart. James was from out of town and came from the big city, where he had already annoyed his parents. His parents, wealthy businessmen, deliberately exiled him to his distant relatives in a provincial town in order to knock him down a notch and moderate his ardor. Seeing Sally at the supermarket, James had no hesitations. He approached her and immediately offered her to go to the movies with him in the evening. Sally was stunned, and the provincial beauty in her confusion yielded to James's brave approach, agreeing to go with him. That night, Sally, for the first time in a long time, felt happy. James came to the date with a bouquet of roses and appeared before her as a gallant gentleman, showering her with compliments. The movie was quite simple, but the young couple likely remembered none of it, as they had been occupied in the back rows of the theater, kissing each other passionately. Cupid had probably already strung his bow then and there, aiming it at the passionate hearts that pulled towards each other so. After that memorable evening, James and Sally began seeing more of each other every day, and with each meeting, they got closer and closer. The climax of their relationship was the night they spent at a motel, after which Sally began to consider herself James's fiancée. Unfortunately, deep down, James didn't share those feelings. He preferred to lead a wild, uncommitted lifestyle. News of Sally's pregnancy sobered the lovers up, who were mad with passion for so long. The naive provincial girl thought that this would mean marriage was around the corner, but, as it turned out, James didn't have that in his plans. Sally, I wanted to tell you, our connection was a mistake. I think we shouldn't see each other anymore. I'm not ready to be a father, and I'm not ready to look into the eyes of my disappointed friends and family, James said, and almost immediately abandoned the girl for whom he claimed to have such fervent love not long ago. After his words, Sally felt disgusting. Tears welled up in her eyes. The girl, brought up on romantic ideals, did not expect such cruelty from someone so close and beloved to her. Without another word, Sally wandered home, struggling to not burst into tears in the middle of the street. James left for home soon after that conversation, where he was immersed in the wildlife of the big city. spreading rumors about how he had seduced a once unapproachable provincial beauty. Meanwhile, Sally, just like her mother once, was left alone, abandoned by a boy who was afraid of the responsibility of being a father to his child. Embarrassed by her growing belly from day to day, the unfortunate orphan constantly felt the unkind looks of the townspeople who considered her a promiscuous girl. Often, in the evenings, Sally wept. She looked at a picture of her mother who had died in childbirth and who didn't have time to enjoy the happiness of motherhood. With each passing day, living in a city whose residents knew everything about each other was becoming unbearable for the pregnant, abandoned girl. In the supermarket, women pointed fingers at Sally and, smiling snidely, exchanged obscene rumors. Unable to endure the taunts and mockery, she gathered her modest belongings and bought a ticket to Bangor. Arriving in one of the largest cities in the state, Sally got a job in a sewing factory and was determined to start her life over. Of course, in the beginning, the girl had to sleep in cheap hostels and roadside hotels until she finally got a place in the dormitory intended for factory employees. Of valuables, Sally only had an old laptop with her that she used to do 3D modeling, a fantastic pastime that eventually became her hobby and source of additional income. She was still far from being a real programmer, of course, but she was not discouraged and honed her skills daily. Over time, Sally finished her 3D design courses and decided to change jobs after graduation. Since she was too far into her pregnancy to continue working in a factory, Sally had to stop. She sent out her resumes to all the offices in the city without exception and waited patiently for an invitation to work. And one day, an offer came from the office of a company that created 3D models of products for online stores. After the interview, Sally, despite her pregnancy, was hired to work remotely. The determined girl latched onto the job like a drowning man onto a life ring. She spent days and nights in front of her laptop screen. She took any work that would bring her any money whatsoever, no matter how meager. Even the birth of her little son, who the happy mother named Peter, couldn't stop her from being creative. With one hand she cradled her belly, Sally refused to go on maternity leave. She tapped at the keys of her laptop, meeting deadlines order after order that she'd received from the head of the firm. Any other girl would have probably given up and gone back to the provincial town, but not Sally, who burned her old bridges and wasn't willing to return to the condemning eyes of her friends. 7 years of good and bad work flew by as if it were a mere 24 hours. Over time, Sally's diligence and innate talent was noticed by her firm's director, who appointed her head of the department. It's hard to even imagine what incredible effort this provincial girl had to endure to achieve this position, one that all of the firm's employees had dreamed of. Now, she is referred to as Miss Brooks by her subordinates. They respectfully bow their heads, admiring her talent in 3D modeling and her stellar business acumen deep in their hearts. Now, Sally's mornings begin with a cup of coffee and a review of the previous day's reports provided by her personal secretary. While his mother continued to climb the career ladder, little Peter lived in the house Miss Brooks had bought with the money from the loan she had taken out. All the while, the boy was being looked after by a nanny who Sally had hired to take care of him. Because of the nature of her job, Miss Brooks often had to use the services of airlines, flying from one side of the country to the other. So it was this time, too, when Sally had the honor of traveling to Chicago, where she was to make a presentation at the firm's headquarters. Absorbed in her thoughts, Miss Brooks boarded the cab that was to take her to the airport with a folder of business papers. With a nod to the driver, Sally concentrated on reading the papers to make good use of her free time to prepare her report. Suddenly, the woman felt the gaze of the cab driver who, without the slightest embarrassment, openly looked at her from head to toe. Sally looked up and quietly groaned. "James? Is that you? What are you doing here?" she asked, holding the gaze of the man who had broken her heart 7 years before. "I'm glad you recognized me. What am I doing? Well, as you can see, I'm working." "And look at you, a real businesswoman," James said in admiration, skillfully maneuvering in the stream of cars flooding the streets. Hearing his last words, Sally noticed herself thinking that deep down, she had absolutely no feelings for her former lover. For a long time, James spoke about his father's company going bankrupt, with him dying of a stroke, not being able to find the strength to survive the final blow of fate. But his words didn't resonate with Sally's soul and sounded unnatural and contrived. Maybe I should tell him about our son, she thought, casting an inquiring glance at James. But when her ex-boyfriend, after letting out a dirty joke, suggested that he and Sally try it all over again, the answer she'd been nurturing for those long, difficult 7 years instantly came to mind. No, James. There's no reason for us to dredge up the past and reanimate something that's been dead for so long. Sorry, but I needed you 7 years ago when I dreamed of marriage and a child together. You were so eager to live a free life that after getting it, you now look to me for help and support. Goodbye, James. I have no time. I'm late for my flight, Sally said at parting and paid for the fare, leaving James a good tip. Clutching the bills in his hands, the driver looked after the elegantly dressed woman whose sincere feelings he so cynically abused years ago. James sadly sighed and, opening the door for another customer, tried to banish that intrusive feeling that was creeping up on him. He realized that he had ruined his chance for a family life in which he made no room for Sally and her child.